Everyone, Peter Zine here, coming to you Christmas Eve morning. I had to get up crazy early in order to shovel snow because I was too lazy to do it yesterday, and shenanigans are about to ensue and we needed to be ready. Anyway, Merry Christmas everyone, and we're going to use this as an opportunity to launch what is going to be an open-ended series on demographics. Population structures are one of the most important things in shaping how an economy does, how well a country does, whether it survives, whether it thrives, whether it succeeds. So we're going to be breaking down the reality of the global demographic situation, which is not great, and going to be looking at a number of different countries to give you an idea of what is coming down the pipe. Now, demographics are about how population structures stack up. So children versus young adults versus mature adults versus retirees. And the normal program is, it looks a little bit like a pyramid with very few retirees at the top and a lot of children down below, and everyone's stacked up in between. And when you have a normal demographic like that, it's going to be relatively inflationary because all those people who are aged 45 and under, the adults are doing all kinds of consuming. They're raising their kids, they're buying their homes, they're going to college, they're spending, building up their lives. And then, of course, anyone who's under 18 is a net beneficiary of that, and that costs money too, to feed and clothe and educate children. So that is where most of the economic activity in most society comes from, people aged 45 and under. Now, once you get to roughly age 40, 42, 65, the kids are moving out, the house has been paid down, and you're in the process of preparing for your retirement. And so your expenses might not be all that much because usually your last kid leaves by the time you're 50 and your house is paid down by the time you're 55 and you're saving for retirement and your income is the highest it will ever be. And in that sort of environment, you're not consuming very much, but you have, lots of money. And that's a different economic model because you literally have decades of experience behind you. You're a very productive worker, but at the end of the day, you're not buying all that much. So all of that money goes into the system. This is the bond market. This is the stock market. This is international investment. This is what drives the investment side of the consumption and investment equation. And then after you turn 65, you retire. You liquidate all of your savings. You go into very boring investments. And at that point, you kind of retire from the system completely, literally and figuratively. Now that's a normal pyramid, but it's all about the stuff at the bottom that drives it because that's the biggest chunk of the population. Well, what we have seen in the days of industrialization and urbanization, especially after World War II, is child mortality has dropped almost to zero. It used to be that upwards of half of all kids died before age 5. Now it's very, very few at all. At the same time that health has improved, and so people are living longer. And so this pyramid, as the children have survived and people have lived longer, it's opened up and it's become kind of a chimney. And for most modern economic systems, this has been what has defined us for the last 70 years. And in that sort of environment, it's a very different system. So in a chimneyed economic model, you have about the same number of children versus young adults versus mature adults. And that gives you a balanced economic structure that we're all familiar with because it's all what we've been living through. But historically speaking, it's relatively atypical. So inflation is broadly under control because there are still a lot of young people, but they're not the dominant group. And there's a lot of capital because you've got all those mature workers up top, but it's not like it's distortionary. So you don't get a lot of bubbles. You don't get a lot of inflation. You've got a balance between consumption and production. And we think of this as normal. It's not. It's just a moment in time because we keep aging. As the birth rate keeps dropping, the bottom starts to narrow. And as lifespans keep expanding, that top gets wider and wider. And eventually we get an inverted pyramid. And what we're seeing in a lot of places like in East Asia and Europe is this is now their dominant pattern, where you've got more people in their 50s and their 40s and their 30s and their 20s and their teens. And in that sort of environment, things get kind of weird. Because when you run out of people below age 40, a lot of that consumption simply goes away. Even worse, you now have a lot of people who are approaching retirement, so they're very capital rich, and that's now your dominant group. So very productive workforce, no hope at all that they could possibly consume everything they build. So when you're in a pyramid, you're in an inflationary system. You probably also have to import a lot because you can't produce everything you consume. But when you're in an inverted pyramid, the consumption goes away, but production's through the roof. You have to be export oriented. And since roughly 2000, this has been the dominant system in Europe and Asia. And it's been part of the reasons why trade relations around the world have gotten worse and worse and worse, because you've got countries that have to export. And then the countries that are left to do the import are like, hey, wait a minute. What about me? Now, you can break most of the world into one of these three categories. So that base pyramidal, where you're early in the industrialization process and you've got a lot of children, this is most of the Arab world. This is most of sub-Saharan Africa. This is parts of Latin America. This is parts of South Asia. And then as it starts to open up into that pyramid, you start getting into, in the early stages, some of those advanced industrialized countries like India or Turkey or Brazil or Mexico, but also some of the developed world who has managed to keep their birth rate relatively stable despite all the other changes, and the United States and France fall into that category. Once it gets open like this, now you're talking Germany, Italy, Korea, even Thailand. The problem we're going to be facing this decade, because we have always known we were going to get here, the problem this decade is the countries that are like this, it's not like their birth rate has increased. There's no longer enough people to have children. And it's not like people have stopped aging, because 10 years later, we're still all 10 years older, because that's how math works. And now it's not just that the 50s are a big block. That big block keeps going up. And we now move into the 60s. And so what we're looking at across the world, advanced and developing countries, is the top bit is now moving into retirement. And we do not have an economic model for what a system looks like where there's no consumption or production or investment. And some of the biggest countries in the world hit that category in the next 8 years. Now, if you want to avoid this sort of future, there are really only two things you can do. Number one, you can get your birth rate back up. And if you're still in that chimney position, you can probably pull that off. But once you've gone inverted, you no longer have enough people aged under 40 to even theoretically try. I mean, you would have to get people in their 50s to kick out kids like they were in their 20s. And even if that was like economically or strategically possible, I'm pretty sure biologically that ship has sailed. The other thing you can do is borrow other people's kids and implement a massive immigration policy in order to bring people in their millions to round up your own population. Now, there are some ways that you can make that work. A lot of the settler societies, it's the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, have found ways to make that work. But we're going to talk in our next session about the country that has pushed this the farthest, and that is Canada. Canada is also the reason why I'm up so goddamn early, because it was a Canadian snowstorm, of course it was, that brought this lovely weather to us. Okay, now, so we've got at least a dozen of these that we're going to be doing over the next few days. They will be proceeding throughout not just the end of December, but into January and February as events allow. But until that such time, I must now get back to those aforementioned shenanigans. I'll see you guys next time.